we'll come to the Essentials Manual to the SINAR System F. The SINAR system is a modular large format camera system consisting of a huge number of configurations and accessories. In the scope of this introduction, we will go through the essentials of using the system. For any closer and or more specific usage of particular accessories and or possibilities, please consult textual SINAR system manual. So, SINAR F, F standing for field, is the lightest and most versatile camera setup from the SINAR family. You may encounter it in various configurations: the standard one, wide angle one, macro and or studio setup, SINAR handy handheld setup, and so on. Apart from that, there also exists SINAR P, P as for perfect, which you may encounter especially in the 8x10 version, SINAR X, lighter version of the P, SINAR C, where C stands for combination or compromise and is consisting of both field parts and perfect, and SINAR E, which is an electronic version of the P. All of these systems differ in details and specific of control, but the overall work with any configuration is still pretty much the same. Now we will take a look at the individual parts of the standard setup. As you can see, when put together, the camera is looking quite complex, but on the contrary, it's quite easy to understand and control. You will usually find the camera in this state without the need of any additional assembly, apart from adding a lens board and film bag. So what does the standard build consist of? Front standard, as well called lens standard, with basic tightening screw and vertical shift and lens board safety holder. Rear standard with focusing calculator, vertical shift and focusing drive, and more stable tightening mount. Then film holder bag with focusing screen and possibly Fresnel lens. Next comes main rail clamp with tripod quick release plate, standard short base rail, standard bellows, standard lens for either 4x5 inches or 9x12 centimeters, or for any other actually format, and possibly film holders. Switching to wide angle build would include replacing the lens for wide angle and replacing the bellows with wide angle option, which can be used with standard setup just as well. By combining both, we get a more versatile setup and the one that is usually taken into field. For the macro, studio and generally over the top setup, we will need probably longer lens, standard bellows, rail extension for close-up shots, middle standard for additional bellows and macro capabilities, additional rail extension, bellows, and possibly even a loop viewfinder. Lenses available for the system range from semi-wide or standard, which is 150mm or 135, to 210, for example, which is a standard lens for 4x5 format, wider options like 90mm or 75mm, super wide angles like 45 or 65, and slightly longer lenses, for example 300mm and above. Optional but useful accessories include manual shutter cable release, focusing loop, Fresnel screen, 9x12 or 4x5 sheet film holders in various quantities, roll film holder, SINAR calculator quick guide, and possibly also a brief guide on operating large format cameras in general. All of this comes nicely packed in a durable and lightweight case, which can also double for a stand in case that additional elevation is needed. Now we are going to take a look on putting the camera together. Firstly, we need to make sure that the tripod head onto which we are mounting the camera is tightly secured in a locked position, as the entire setup can be quite heavy and prone to falling in unexpected moments. Once secured, we can mount the base rail clamp and check that the quick release lever is locked correctly. After that, we can start by adding the base rail. Notice that the base rail has both ends black and is fixed. We will check again that the base rail is securely locked and cannot slide or rotate by accident. We will then proceed by sliding the rear standard onto the rail, locking it in place with the locking knob on the bottom. We will also check that all the standard's movements are locked in default position. Both of the latches on the top of the standard will remain open as long as there is no focusing screen and or bellows mounted. Front lens standard is mounted onto the rail in a similar fashion. We slide it onto the rail and lock it in place. We will also check and reset all the movements and both latches into their open positions. We continue by adding the bellows in between the standards. First we load it into the bottom groove on the inside part of the standard, whichever does not really matter in this case, and then we gently push it into the vertical position and lock the inner latch safely, securing the top of the bellows frame in the upper lock. We repeat the same process for the other standard. Slide it in the bottom groove, gently tilt it to vertical position and secure by the inner latch. Next comes the focusing screen and film holder mechanism, with the process being just the same. Slide it into the bottom groove, tilt vertical and secure the latch. The focusing screen can be positioned either for vertical or horizontal image. Make sure you mind the orientation so that the film holders can be loaded into the back either from the top or either side. As for the lens board, just repeat the process once again and always remember to make sure to check that all the parts are secured in place before you release hold of them. Now we are going to push our setup a little bit more to the extreme by setting it up for a close-up shot. For that, we first need to install an extension rail. Note that the end cap is red, which means that it can be rotated and so screwed into the base rail. For specific macro shots, we might even need to include a second extension rail, which is really making the setup a little bit difficult to use, but we are gonna go that way right now. Once the rails are in place, we can slide the standards apart. As you can notice, the bellows can only stretch so far. That is when our middle standard and additional bellows comes in handy, well, in case we need them. To install these, we first need to unlock one of these inside latches, securing the bellows in place. Make sure to unlock just the one on the inside part without letting loose either the focusing screen or the lens board. After that, we can slide the standards further and mount the middle one. You can see I am mounting it onto the lens side of the main clamp, and that is to help with the overall balance of the system. Then, using the same process, we secure both bellows in place and check that everything is stable. Keep in mind that the light has to pass from the lens to the actual screen, and all the standards therefore should be in one line. Now that we have camera built, let's go through the available movements. The entire system can be rotated on its straight axis by unlocking the tightening screw on the main clamp. This can be used either to compensate for the unlevel tripod positioning or simply to rotate the view. Make sure the screw is tightened as much as possible to prevent accidental flip. Both the front and rear standard have rise and fall movements available by unlocking the side clamping wheel. The rear standard has also the fine focusing drive with a depth of field calculator. To vertically shift the standard, make sure you securely hold the standard and then unlock the clamping wheel as much as necessary for free movement. You will then be able to move the standard to desired position and securely lock it again. The rear standard clamping wheel can be used to the same effect. Always make sure that you prevent any accidental slide, especially with heavy lenses on the standard. The rear standard also allows for fine focusing using the focusing drive knob. Note that this is for fine focusing only. The coarse focusing has to be done by sliding the entire standard on the rail. On the side of both standards, you can also find the clamping levers for tilt control. By unlocking these, the standard can be unlocked for horizontal tilt movements. On the opposite side from the tilt lever, you can find the angle scale for those movements, which we will get to later on. On the respective back and front of the rear and lens standard, you can also see the lateral shift and tilt clamp. By releasing the clamp, you can easily rotate the standard to desired angle and/or shift it to the sides. After applying changes, remember to lock the clamp again. Both the lateral and vertical shifts can also be used to effectively fine-tune the position of the camera itself when applied to both standards in the same amount and direction. Focusing on the subject is achieved in a combination of steps. The first step is to move the entire rear standard into approximate focus location in regard to the image on the focusing screen and lock it in place. After that, we can apply the fine focusing using a rotation of the focusing drive knob. The process can take quite some time, especially if the scene is dimly lit. In such a case, we might need to use additional light just for the process of focusing, or at least a focusing loop to enlarge fine detail on the screen. When using a loop, do not forget to remove the Fresnel lens if it is in place. The Fresnel lens helps with viewing the overall image, but can complicate the focusing process. The focusing screen itself may come with different grid layout. The base grid is just a plain 1 cm square layout without any markers indicating any specific film size. For shooting using roll film holders, using a screen with roll film format instead might be beneficial. Not exactly part of the process of focusing, but quite an essential part of work with any large or medium format camera system is usage of scale calculator for measuring necessary extension of the exposure depending on the bellows extension or scale transformation. The calculator consists of two parts: the target, that is to be placed and the place of subject into the scene, and the scale measuring part, which we can effectively measure the needed exposure extension or aperture decrease to get our film exposed properly. In this specific case, our scale suggests 1/3 of a stop extension. So as you can see, this technique is useful, especially for close-up shots with more significant scale transformation. In other words, when shooting macro. SINAR depth of field calculator, or in other words, a tool that can help you get your entire image in focus, sort of. On the rear standard focusing knob, you can see a peculiar scale divided in two stripes. That is the actual calculator. Depending on whenever you are using roll film or sheet film, the corresponding scale applies. First step in the process is to focus on the most distant part of our subject that we need to have in focus and reset the calculator by rotating it separately to point at the marker. Once that is set up, we can refocus onto the closest part of the subject. While doing so, you may notice the calculator moving along. Once we are focused, we can get the reading on the scale. It tells us what lens aperture setup should be used for the specific scene to end up mostly in focus. Once we set that up, we need to use the focusing knob once again to move the focus to the actual ideal focal point for the scene. We can do that by going back with the focusing knob by 2 full stops on the calculator scale. Keep in mind that only either a 4x5 scale or roll film scale applies, depending on which film size you are using. Once we move back those 2 stops, we are in an optimal focus for the scene. Scheimpflug rule SINAR calculator. The basic principle of the Scheimpflug rule applied to photography is that normally the lens and image planes of the camera are parallel, and the plane of focus is parallel to the lens and image planes. If a subject, such as the side of a building, is also parallel to the image plane, it can coincide with the plane of focus, and the entire subject can then be rendered sharply. If the subject plane is not parallel to the image plane, imagine objects lying on a table, it will be in focus only along a line where it intersects with the plane of focus. Therefore, by altering the tilt of the lens plane and or image plane and making this plane intersect with the subject plane in an imaginary point, we can render the subject sharply even if it is not parallel to any of the planes. To use the Sinar Scheimpflug calculator, the following steps follow. First, focus on the most distant part of the scene you still need to be rendered sharply. Then reset the rotating angle metering scale on the left side of the rear standard by aligning the 0 with the marker. Next step is to refocus onto the closest part of the subject. While doing that, you may notice that the angle scale is rotating along. Once focused on the closest point required to be in focus, you can read out the indicated value from the angle scale and use that value to tilt either the lens standard or the rear standard at that specific angle. While determining in which direction to tilt the standard, imagine all of the planes, the rear standard plane, the lens plane, and the subject plane, intersecting in one imaginary point. Tilting lens standard results only in focal plane adjustment, while tilting rear standard results in focal plane adjustment and perspective distortion. After tilting the standard, we need to refocus the scene once more, and we should be able to see the resulting shift of sharpness immediately. If necessary, the process can be repeated, and the newly acquired angle can be then added to the already existing tilt. Operating the lenses, shutters, cable releases, and so on. To successfully expose an image, you will need to make sure you can manage the lens operations correctly as well. We start by mounting it in a proper manner. We slide the lens board into the bottom groove first and then tilt it to the vertical position and secure it with the latch on the right top corner of the front standard. We can mount the lens in whatever rotation we want to, so that we can access controls easily. If the lens is already open, it is so because the opening lever is activated. In this state, we can easily focus and compose our image. To load and trigger the shutter, we need to close it though to prevent any damage to the mechanism. So once it is closed, we can start by loading the shutter, setting up the exposure time, which should have been done before loading the shutter actually, and selecting aperture we would like to use. Once done, the shutter can be triggered. You can see that we can also close down the aperture while the lens is in the focusing mode to be able to evaluate the depth of field. The shutter we are using right now is the latest generation of the Copal shutter systems. You will also most likely encounter previous generations that come in silver color, but the system is very much the same. Try to keep in mind to always change the exposure time before loading the shutter, especially with these older models. Next thing you may come across is the SINAR DB system lenses. These lenses require external shutter as they do not have any controls on the lens board itself. So to use these properly, you need to mount and operate the SINAR shutter, which we'll be doing right now. Please note that the SINAR shutter is an extremely fragile device and needs to be handled and operated very carefully. The SINAR shutter can be mounted in between the front standard and the bellows. So the process of installing one requires unmounting the bellows from the front standard and securing the shutter in its place instead. Once it is secured, we can mount the bellow onto the shutter by inserting it into the groove and securing the sliding latch on the top of the shutter. And double check that everything is secured. Next, we mount the lens. Pay attention to correct orientation this time, as all the red points have to match. Once the lens is locked in place, you may notice that we are still in the focusing mode, as is also signaled by the little red pin on top of the shutter. To switch to the capturing mode, you will need to lift the red lever on the side of the shutter up till it clicks in place. Now the shutter is closed and we can select desired exposure time on the top dial and dial in an aperture on the side scale. Once that is done, we can press the mounted shutter button or cable release and expose. To switch back to focusing, we need to press the red button on the side just above the red lever. Under any circumstances, do not force the shutter button or cable release when the shutter is opened. To use a flash with the Sinar shutter, a special connector between the sync cable and the shutter is needed. While using a regular on-lens Copal style shutter, the flash sync cable or wireless control can be plugged into the sync port on the shutter directly. In case a cable release is needed, it can be screwed into the cable release port next to the actual trigger. Mounting a holder onto the camera. Once our scene is properly composed and focused, we can put a film holder onto the camera. Make sure that everything is tightly secured to not allow the camera to move, as you won't see anything through the lens as long as the holder is on the camera. First step is to close down the lens to prevent any potential light leak. Once we have that closed, we can also load the shutter and set the correct aperture. When loading sheet film holders, you may notice that the dark slides have two distinct faces, while the black one means it has already been exposed. The white one is signaling loaded unexposed film, so make sure to insert the holder into the camera with the unexposed sheet facing toward the lens. To actually slide the holder into the focusing bag, you may notice that we have two levers by the sides of the screen. You can see that by pulling at either one of them, we can open a slot in between the rear standard and the focusing frame. Then gently slide the holder inside with the correct side facing the lens. Try to do that as gently as possible, as too much force may introduce movement to your camera setup. Once the holder is securely loaded, we can recheck that your lens is set up and closed. After that, we can safely remove the lens-facing dark slide from the holder. And as everything is ready and the shutter is set, we can take the actual picture. After the exposure, we need to return the dark slide in place. This time reversed, with its back stripe facing front, so that we can tell that this film has already been exposed. After that, we can backtrack the process and gently lift the focusing screen and pull out the holder. Once the holder is out and securely stored in the dark pocket, a bag, a pouch, or something similar, we can open the lens again, reset the aperture to fully open, and proceed with our next shot. Mounting a Horseman style roll film holder onto the camera is slightly different than a regular sheet film holder. We start the process again once we have our image composed and focused by closing the lens, loading the shutter, and setting up whatever aperture we need for the specific shot. Once ready, we first need to remove the focusing screen by pressing onto two thin serrated profiles against the rear standard while holding it in place and sliding the focusing screen upwards in case of vertical orientation or sideways in case of horizontal orientation to unhook it. Once it is unhooked, we will safely store it and we can mount the film back in place and lock it with the press-in side strips. So once the holder is in place and the side strips have been securely pressed in place, we should try that the holder holds in place as well. If it does, we can remove the dark slide, recheck the camera, take our picture and forward the film to a new frame by pushing the securing lock on the back of the holder and then winding the film advance lever till next frame is reached. Lastly, we also need to insert the dark slide again. Then we can either proceed with shooting by repeating the process, or we can unlock the side strips, remove the holder, and mount the focusing screen. To mount the focusing screen, check out the mounting mechanism first. By depressing those two serrated profiles, you can see the hooks disengaging from the module, so while pressing them, you need to put it in place and slide it to a secured position by engaging the hooks. Make sure to triple check that the focusing screen holds securely before you let it go. Film holders. There is quite a few different types of holders available for the SINAR system, or any large format system for that matter, so we will start from the classical sheet film holders for either 4x5 inch film format, 9x12 centimeters film format, or any other formats for that matter. We will go over the revolver style multi-film holders, and we will end up with various types of roll film holders. Sheet film. The main difference between 9x12 and 4x5 film holders is of course the size of the film that can be used. While on the outside they might appear the same, they are not interchangeable, as 4x5 film is not going to fit into a 9x12 holder, and 9x12 film is not going to hold properly inside slightly larger 4x5 film holder. Here we can see them side by side. As the films have to be loaded in total darkness, they have a notch in the upper right corner. As long as this notch is correctly oriented, the emulsion layer is going to be facing the lens of the camera. The notches come in a variety of different shapes, depending on the specific film being used, but their location is always the same. So, loading a sheet film. Mind that the process has to be done in a complete darkness. Firstly, we prepare our film holder by sliding out the dark slide. Rotate the safety latches so that it can be slid out and move it about 2/3 of the way. It is better to leave the dark slide partially in the holder so that you do not have to hunt it down in the dark. Rotate the holder so that the dark slide is pointing to you and flip out the bottom light guard. Then, as you already have the box with films ready and opened, take out a single sheet. Make sure that you can feel the notch with your right index finger. If you do, the light-sensitive emulsion is facing you, and you can proceed with sliding the film inside the holder. Try to touch the film as little as possible, as touching the sensitive layer can leave marks. Pay attention to sliding it in without any larger resistance underneath the side rails, so that the sheet film holds firmly and cannot fall out. You can check if the film is correctly loaded by slightly lifting the upper corners, which should be possible about the same on both corners, and the film should not feel like wiggling to the sides while doing so. Once that is done, you can close the bottom light guard flap, and while holding it closed, gently slide the dark slide all the way in. And that's it, one sheet loaded. On the dark slide itself, you may notice that one side has a white stripe or markings while the other has black. That is a marker for you to be able to easily identify which films have already been exposed, as after each shot you will be returning the dark slide into the holder with its black stripe facing outwards, and during each reloading of the holder you will revert it back to its white striped side, signaling unexposed film inside. And of course you can use the safety latches to prevent accidental opening of the dark slide while manipulating with the holder. Horseman roll film back. The Horseman roll film holder comes in either 6x9 or 6x7 format, and the loading is quite common. First step is to unlock the safety latch on the dark slide side of the holder. By doing so, the holder case will open and we can remove the inside. As you can see, the bottom part of the spool holding knobs can be depressed, effectively releasing the empty spool already in place. We move this empty spool to the right side to function as a film winding spool by again depressing the lower knob and then slipping it into position. We can check that the spool is correctly in place by winding the film transport lever. Then we are going to load an actual film on the left side of the holder. Note that this process should be done in subdued light conditions to minimize the risk of any light leaks. As you can see, we are loading the film with its blacks inside facing outward, while any text on the roll film backing paper should be facing inside. We secure the film spool into the holding knobs and wrap the backing paper all the way around the holder, while making sure that we can see only plain black wrapping paper on the camera facing side of the holder. Now you can note the visible double-sided arrow on the film spool. As we will be loading the film onto the empty spool, the arrow will appear in the round window indicating that the film is loaded correctly and ready. To proceed, we slot the end of the backing paper into the empty spool. This part can take a while to get done so that the film stays put, and then we slowly start winding the transport lever while still holding the end of the paper in the spool slot. We keep winding the film till the arrow we noticed earlier appears in the round window inside the holder. If we cannot seem to see it, recheck once again that there is indeed no lettering visible on the film paper backing on the camera facing part of the holder. Also check that both spools are securely slotted in their positions. And now we can put the inside part of the holder into its light-tight casing. Make sure to tightly close the back without applying any brute force and slide the side lock to its locked position. You can then proceed with winding the film transport lever till number 1 appears in the frame count window. And that's it, we are loaded.